Hey everyone, welcome to Collective Power, reporting on labor in a capitalist society. We have been informed, us on the panel, that there are lots of questions, so we're just going to jump right into it. I'm going to introduce myself briefly and our two panelists today. I'm Alex Press. I'm a staff writer at Jacobin Magazine, where I report on the labor movement. I have also freelanced all over the place, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, of course, and so on. I'm also a member of the News Guild of New York. My two co-panelists, though really I'm a moderator, but we're all practicing labor journalists up here, are Luis Feliz Leon, who is an organizer and staff writer for both Labor Notes and In These Times. An ex-Nation intern, Luis has written widely on issues relating to labor and union organizing. The other panelist we have today is Sarah Jaffe, who is the author of Work Won't Love You Back: How Devotion to Our Jobs Keeps Us Exploited, Exhausted, and Alone, and of Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt, both from Bold Type Books. Sarah is another ex-Nation intern who reports on the politics of power from the workplace to the streets. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, The Guardian, The Washington Post, many, many other places. So we're going to jump right into it. The first thing I want us to each speak about today is how we got into labor reporting and our career trajectories. I'm going to open because I actually got into labor reporting by pitching the Nation's submissions inbox in 2016. And that was my first publication, was, I believe, the Nation's student journalist kind of column. And I was writing about the university where I was then a new grad student, Northeastern University, which was fighting its adjuncts over a first contract. So that was the first thing I ever wrote. And I did it because I planned to use it as an excuse to get to know the adjuncts, because I was in early stages of trying to form a graduate student union and wanted to build those relationships. So it was a sort of secret agent, ulterior motive for becoming a journalist. And then over time, I always joke that I just realized I was a better writer than a union organizer. And that is how I got into labor journalism. And since then, I've been at Jacobin for almost 6 years. I was the assistant editor there for a few years, and then switched over to staff writing. So Luis, Sarah, what are your trajectories?
So, I started as an intern at The Nation, doing editorial fact-checking in 2013. And my first published story was also in the Student Nation about student organizing in Arizona. And we had guest speakers like Sarah come and talk to us when I was an intern, and Doug Henwood and others. And then from there, I went on to do comms work for a number of unions, including 32BJ, SEIU, the Mason Tenders Council in New York City, and then a bunch of other nonprofit jobs, and found my way back to journalism during the pandemic. So that briefly has been my trajectory, a circuitous route.
Hi. Yeah, I was also a Nation intern, as everybody else has said already. I was a Nation intern in the summer of 2009, which was a very interesting time to be trying to write about the economy because it was on fire. And there were not a lot of labor journalists around at that point in time. It's really nice to actually be on a panel of two other people who do this full time, because that just wouldn't have been possible when I started at The Nation. And Max Frazier was the intern coordinator there, who is now a full-time labor historian. And he also published my first labor piece, which was about the Philadelphia Museum of Art security guards unionizing. And I have been full-time freelance since 2014, when I had been also a staff writer in These Times. And it was a grant-funded sort of one-year thing that ended. And basically, I've been trying to make ends meet since then, mostly with the help of the formerly Nation Institute, now the Type Media Center Fellowship that supported me for a lot of that time, and also writing books.
Great. And I just echo for folks who are going to have questions, that I think all three of us kind of come from different eras that we entered this work. And yet I know I can speak for all of us that, we overlap a lot, because it is a fairly small community, even as it has grown, as far as people doing this reporting in particular on the labor movement. So any questions you have, dealing with the past decade or more of the labor movement, I think each of us could answer. The next thing I wanted to ask was any advice you have for young people who are interested in getting into this work, as well as any advice you wish that you had taken or been informed of early on and kind of had to learn the hard way. So I want to ask you both that question first rather than answering it myself.
I feel like the advice I would give now and the advice that I wish I had had back then would be two totally different things, because like when I was starting, there were basically two people that I had seen who were doing a thing that I wanted to do. And it was Barbara Ehrenreich, who we lost this year, and Liza Featherstone, who I tried to convince Peter to add to this panel. Because I was like, why is nobody writing about this stuff? And so for me, I really had to have some help carving out space for myself. Esther Kaplan, who used to run the Investigative Fund, was a huge support, and Laura Flanders, who I worked for after I was a Nation intern. And they gave me really good advice that is less necessary now, because I think we just have to spend less time convincing editors that labor stories matter than I did at the first time when I had to beg, like, frankly, even the Nation to let me do a labor story. And so I think the unfortunate advice that I have to give everybody now is that there still aren't jobs, that there are very few publications that have staff labor reporters. And the two people on the panels with me have a couple of the only staff positions you can have. And Luis, in fact, has two of them because they still don't pay very well. And so I think that the challenge that you have now is less convincing people that labor matters. And it's more like figuring out how to pay your bills when you're stringing together freelance stories at a bunch of different publications that pay at like wildly different rates for the same work. And yeah, how you're going to make that a survivable career, life, part-time gig even. That's like the real messiness of it, is that it's really hard. And the other thing that's changed in the amount of time since I became a journalist full-time is that there has been a wave of unionization among journalists. And I should make Alex talk about the contract that they have at Jacobin, because they've got some really great stuff in there. And that's like one of the reasons that there's better labor coverage now, is that a lot of journalists have been through unionizing. And so even if they're not labor reporters, now they know things about unions that they just didn't know 10 years ago.
Luis?
Yeah. I mean, I think practically I couldn't make it as a freelancer like in 2013. So my only option was to work for the comms departments of various unions. And like Sarah mentioned, I mean, at that time, I remember Sarah writing Michelle Chen and Josh Idelson and David Molberg in these times. Like those were like the people that you knew that were reporting on labor stories. So I think things have changed in terms of where I currently work as a staff writer at Labor Notes. During that time, Labor Notes was also like the only other place where in really dark times, people kept alive the hope that, workers and the structural power that unions have can transform society. And I think for me, it has been instructive to read Labor Notes, to work at Labor Notes. One of the things practically that I would say, if you're thinking of the labor beat, is go out to picket lines and talk to workers yourself directly, bypass the comms department. So I think Alex does this as well, I think, a lot in her reporting. Or all of us, I think, on this
Real talk.
Yeah. So, I mean, Labor Notes in particular has like a critical intervention, right, in the labor movement. Like we don't need to explain why labor unions matter in our stories. We believe that it does. But what we do is talk about when unions are not democratic, when members are vote down TAs and the leadership forces them through. So I think for us, it's important to hold up a mirror to the working class, especially the unionized workers, and say, like, here's where other fights are. So to the extent that you can see yourself as reporting for the working class, I think the more power to you. that's the audience I write for.
Yeah. And Sarah, I'm glad you sort of spoke about the sort of the sad state of the political economy of labor reporting itself, which, is only an extreme version of the state of reporting in general on any topic. But I sort of wanted to make everyone speak a little more about like the nuts and bolts of advice, because I was thinking about this question before, and, I was like, okay, well, when I started writing, as I mentioned, I had no reporting experience and just sort of pitched a slush pile on the Nation's website. And one thing I was very worried about was like, I don't have any qualifications here. I don't know any journalists. I remember trying to figure out the law in Massachusetts. Am I allowed to secretly record someone? And someone was like, no, you can't do that. And I was like, wow, what other things do I need to know that I've never even thought of?
50 different state laws on one party, two-party consent.
Exactly. And now, I think the thing I would have told myself is, of course, you should know the legal specifics of certain things, but worry a lot less about kind of experience or qualifications and really focus a lot more on knowing something, right? So if you're interested in the labor beat, live in the labor beat and in the labor movement, which doesn't mean, we'll get to this, I think, talking about sympathy and boosterism versus kind of critical reporting, but really immerse yourself in the world of the subject you want to write about. Because being an expert on, you've read about trucking forever, truckers, you're interested in the industry and how it's changed. If you want to pitch someone about that topic, it's way more important that you actually have something to say and who to talk to for an article, rather than that you've been published before, in that publication. I think that is something I end up telling young journalists a lot, is just like, read widely, read deeply in the specific beat that you want to be on, and really figure out who are the people to talk to. I think another truism of reporting is that a good reporter just knows who to get on the phone. Because certainly my strength, I would say, is not that I think I know everything, but I do know who does know everything, and I can call them. And so things like that, if Luis or Sarah, if you have anything to add along those lines, I think that would be great.
Yeah, those are such good points. I think related to that, that it is so much about who you know. And in terms of living on your beat, I publish about like 100th of the things that I know and the things that I hear from people. And it's not just like the press releases that come in. It's the conversations that I have at the bar. It's the meetings that I take when I'm in a city. Like I was just in Minneapolis, and just sitting down with people and being like, what are you working on? What's coming in the next 6 months? What's your plan for the next year? So that you know what's happening and have a mental map of things that people are doing. I love Luis's comment to skip the PR department. We will leave Berlin Rosen out of this. But a good beat reporter knows what they don't know. As Alex was saying, right? Knowing who to call it first requires you to look yourself in the mirror and say, I don't know this. And I see a lot of what's happening now, and I know I just said that we're getting a lot better labor coverage because a lot of reporters have been through unionizations, but we're also getting these like very, very hyped moments. Both of you two have covered the recent Amazon stuff more than I have, so you can speak to this more. These very, very exciting moments where labor stuff breaks through into the mainstream, and then you just get a ton of stories that are just straight up wrong about things. Mm-hmm. There was a piece yesterday that I saw several labor lawyers pointing out that was like getting this recent Supreme Court decision just wrong. And so like as important as it is to know what you know, is to sort of know, like, I'm not a labor law expert. I'm a nerd about several things, one of them being history. When there's a wanky story on labor law, I got to call a bunch of people because I do not understand the law. And also in this country, we have 50 different labor laws because we have 50 different states. And there are all sorts of weird regulations that you have to figure out. So like being very, very honest with yourself about what you don't know when you're still learning. Tons of people are willing to help. And I think we who are already doing this work, like we actually do like to see other people come into it. So it's exciting to be here, talking to people who want to come into labor journalism. And I think we will do our best to be as supportive as we can if people are respectful of our time.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of that. I think in addition to what Alex mentioned about like reading up on your beat, I feel like in the labor journalism community, there's a lot of solidarity. So I think it's easier sometimes when you're like trying to figure something out to reach out to people. And I think that's kind of like a shift that has happened. Brendan O'Connor, who was an intern when I was at The Nation, he wrote a piece in a DSA publication about like this shift that happened. I think he was at Gawker at the time, where like journalists started seeing themselves as workers. And I think that has also translated into the way that we relate to one another, where it's like there's solidarity like versus competition, where we share like sources with each other. We try to support one another. And if we get something wrong, people call us in and tell us like, hey, you talk to this person. So I think that's key. I think one of the things that I would add that I try to do in my stories, and I would hope that other journalists that are coming up try to do this as well, is put workers in a position where they're the experts, right? Like, I don't know what it's like to work at an Amazon facility. And one of the injustices of being a freelancer is that you are forced to do all this work, all this background research that's unpaid. So I write about the Mexican labor movement, for instance, and I've had to read a lot of shit about like how labor law works in Mexico while also covering the US labor movement. And that's really hard to do. So I think one way around that is to not reach out to workers just to talk about like how exploitative like their jobs are and how victimized they are, but the power that they have as workers and showcasing that, which is why like I didn't mean to be like too cheeky, because sometimes I do work with comms people, because there's some unions that you just can't get to workers and you have to work through them. So, but the reason why I say bypass the comms people is because they won't really give you that, right? Like you won't know like who's in organizing. We talk about like who's the leader, right, of this group, like who has followers, like we like to say at Labor Notes. So I think when you are going out to a picket line, you're able to find that out and then showcase like, hey, workers know how this runs. Workers should run society. Like they should run their workplaces. So that's another insight that I wish I had arrived at earlier in terms of like the reporting.
Yeah. I'd say another thing that sort of comes to mind listening to both your comments is, I have a little pet theory about, the logic of organizing and the logic of media are often kind of at like loggerheads. They're kind of the opposite. It feels like media encourages kind of self-promotion and unearned confidence and, these sort of, which I understand why people are like that. But, the logic of organizing is like listening, humility, knowing what you don't know, asking others. And so I think, this sort of, I think the comments that have been said about, just sort of being in your beat and kind of knowing who to talk to and kind of constantly being in touch with workers that you might in the future write about or interview or not, just because you want to be accountable to the community that you're writing on, in the case of labor reporting, that being the working class, that kind of helps stop the problem of the media kind of like pressure on you, right? To just pump out pieces that are not right or are kind of, would read like another language to a worker in the industry they are about. If those workers have your phone number, they can call you and say that wasn't right. Like this, you got this wrong. And so I think that building those relationships is really kind of the key thing I want to impart to people, because it also helps what's coming up in the future and helps you, whether it's getting scoops or kind of writing pieces that are going to be important in the coming months or years. It's really this constant kind of relationship building that I think characterizes a really good journalist, a really good reporter. Yeah. And so I also just want to flag that, yes, Jacobin is union, and we have a fairly good contract, given that, just to be frank, Jacobin does not have a lot of money. We have, a sabbatical that I just took for 6 months that you can take and keep your health care, things like that. There are all these little ways that I think left media in particular is trying to figure out a way to make this sustainable. And I know Luis as well could speak to some of these, some of that kind of behind the scenes, like make a living off of this question. If people, I'm just flagging it to say if people in the question and answer session, which we'll get to in about 15 minutes, want to ask, I'm happy to. Also, I'll just say to confirm what Sarah has said about the wave of unionization. I mean, I was the shop steward at Jacobin, which put me on the new News Guild in New York's executive board. And it was incredible to watch all of these journalists who would reach out to me, both as a kind of known labor reporter and also as a union member, to ask advice about unionizing, and then see them go through this process where when they would reach out to me, in 2017, say they had no idea about unions or kind of the nuts and bolts of this stuff. And now some of them have become labor reporters because they kind of realized that, oh, this is a whole world of like drama and, high highs and low lows and very big stakes that I just had assumed was boring or like stayed and, from another era. And I think that is kind of a key kind of way to view the labor beat, is like, this is where the drama is. These are real stakes. And there are like very interesting people fighting fights against incredible odds that I think makes the labor beat really exciting. And it's been fun to watch a lot of journalists kind of come to that realization because they became people in those stories and realized, oh, wait a minute, this is actually really interesting stuff. So the last kind of major question that I wanted to ask both of you is about sympathy, solidarity, and boosterism. So, all of us, I think I can speak for all of us that when I say that we're all on the side of the workers, when the matter is workers versus bosses, and yet we're reporters. We want to get the story right. And there's often a tension, maybe it's not always a tension, but sometimes between kind of boosterism or serving as like basically a union's PR department in the form of an article versus kind of critical reporting. So I just want to ask each of you how you balance the question of, writing about things you have sympathy for without being boosterish.
Yeah, this is such a central point. And I think the first thing that I want to say is just that like every decision you make while doing journalism is political. And this is true of every beat. It's not just true of labor journalism. It's true of covering, Wall Street. It's true of lifestyles reporting, right? Every choice that you make about who to cover, what to feature, where it goes, how you write about it, who you interview, who you don't interview, what you learn that you publish, what you learn that you don't publish. All of those are political choices. And that's true no matter what, whether or not you think about them that way or not, they are political choices. So we're making a series of those choices every time we decide to cover something, every time we decide not to cover something. And sometimes I'd like decide not to cover something because like other people are on it. Like Alex and Luis had the Amazon stuff down. I was like, oh, I can go cover other things. I don't live in New York anymore. This is somebody else's story. It doesn't need 20 million labor journalists doing it. Fine. So that's like, sometimes there are decisions that are just that basic as to why to not cover something. But other times it's like, this is not at a place where covering it is going to be useful. There are questions that I think are really interesting now, speaking of the Amazon union, right? That like, there have been some not so great stories in the New York Times and in the Business Insider about ALU. And I think the challenge now is like, when do we, who are not the capitalist press, wade into these things that are messy? It's not an easy decision. It's not an easy decision to have to fight with the comms people, as Luis was saying, when they want you to cover something a certain way and you say, that's not the story though. Or they want to give you certain people to talk to and you're like, no, I want to talk to the workers, not the president of the union. It's hard because on one hand, people would be mad at you for being too critical. And on the other hand, people would be mad at you for being too boosterish. And I have been joking a lot about getting the lines from Amilcar Cabral tattooed across my chest: "Tell no lies, claim no easy victories," which is a broader thing that actually says something about keep nothing hidden from the masses of the working class, which it's great advice for journalism. Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. But in between that, there's a whole lot of space to make decisions. I think being too boosterish, the simple answer is tell no lies. If I do not think that this thing is as hype as everybody else in the world does, I'm either not going to cover it, or I'm going to find a way to quietly say, like, maybe this isn't going to change the world, without saying, therefore, these workers suck. You know, we have a lot of stories about like the first union at such and such a thing. And it's like, great. But the fact that we have like a long string of first unions at something actually means we've been losing for 40 years, you know? And so I would like us to stop being as excited about the first union at such and such and more excited about the 15th union at such and such, the 20th union at such and such. But a lot of editors will say, well, the 20th union is not a story. So you sort of have this like triangle of interests to balance, right? One is what editors will publish, especially when you're freelance. Two is what you think the actual story is. And three is like, are you doing right by the people you're writing about? And as both Alex and Luis have said, like being accountable to the people you're covering rather than some imagined audience of sort of middle-class people elsewhere, is a good way to sort of hold yourself. You know, if I publish this and I send this to the workers that I interviewed, are they going to call me an asshole? Are they going to tell me that I got it wrong? Are they just going to be like, ugh, whatever, her? Or are they going to say, yeah, you told our story right? That is not about being boosterish. It's about doing telling the story correctly, which is, and it should always be, the sort of main goal of journalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, because I see myself as part of like being like people have different meanings for this word, but I see myself as a movement journalism militant. So I think sometimes when workers come to me with a story, like I can do a bait and Labor Notes classically does this. It's like a bait and switch about how we build like a network among workers, let's say in logistics, and we put workers in touch with each other. So it's not like purely for journalistic purposes. There's a larger political project that I'm a part of, which is around building rank and file power. So sometimes, like with Amazon, for instance, like I know like a DSP driver like reached out to me, like, we're gonna go on strike tomorrow. I mean, we want you to tell our story. You know, I was like, hold up, okay, tell me a little bit more. What's your organizing committee look like? Who's involved? And sometimes what ends up happening is that I actually put on my organizer hat and don't report the story and just connect them to other workers so they can work through some things before they just go out there and try to get media attention too prematurely, right? So that's one way of like addressing the because workers see, for instance, what happened with the ALU, and they think that's the way to go. They think getting a lot of media attention is really going to help. And sometimes there has to be like some inoculation that you do as a labor reporter. I feel like if you've been part of, as all of us have had some involvement in union campaigns, we know like what the steps are in a campaign. So sometimes it might be like just connecting them to another worker, right? And that's how we build the class, or a class feeling among workers, like you're not alone in this. So I think that's part of the work that I do a lot of times, which is on-scene work, which goes to the relationship building that Alex mentioned, and the tension between like media, self-promotion, and like the basics of organizing around listening and connecting with people. And then the other thing sometimes is, with some unions, for instance, let's say with the UAW, like the reformers don't have all the contacts, right? In like UAWD doesn't have all the contacts. So one of the roles that we play as reporters is talking to other workers, and then they meet and learn about all these folks. So I think that there's like all these different ways that we contribute to the movement that are not like, that fall outside like the boosterism, like question if we are movement journalists. I think that boosterist question sometimes comes more from like our liberal critics that think that we are somewhat biased. So I also want to kind of deflate that a little bit, because if I think about the political like reporters in Washington, they do this whole thing for access where they'll write like a favorable story so that they get callbacks, you know. Sometimes it ends up like, I'll give the example of the Amazon labor union. The first story I wrote for Labor Notes was very critical. I mean, I was very critical of the Amazon labor union. I would admit that that was like where I was. And then I kind of shifted a little bit. And people reached out and said like, you know, we learned something from your story, even though we thought it was like harsh. But the reason why was because I actually went out to the fucking warehouse, spent a bunch of days outside talking to workers. So it wasn't like I was just like armchair quarterbacking about it. Like I actually put in some work and spoke to people. So that gave me some credibility. And then it was more like, okay, how can we talk with you and support your efforts, you know, as Labor Notes, and connected them with other people and so forth. So to me, I think it's less relevant, the boosterism question, because I'm very clear about what kind of reporter I am and what kind of function I play in the labor movement. But as a freelancer, I do think sometimes that comes up. Like, for instance, with the Mexican labor union coverage that I've done. Yeah, I've also done trainings for the people that are unionizing, forming independent unions in Mexico. So I remember one story was killed because like I did a training and it was like, well, this is who I am. Like, I mean, I can't, like you got to find another reporter. So ultimately, like the story wasn't written because I disclosed like, yeah, I've done some trainings for these workers as part of my Labor Notes job. So yeah, sometimes you win some, sometimes you lose some, but I believe in like my class independence as a labor journalist and will, like sacrifice a story basically. If the organizing, because the organizing ultimately takes precedence. So that's my roundabout answer.
I think that was a great answer, Luis. And yeah, I mean, when I get asked this question, I usually say, you know, of course you don't want to, I mean, what Luis is saying about it's okay to be harsh as long as you put in the work, I think is true. People will react poorly if you're armchair kind of like quarterbacking a union movement because the stakes are so high for the people involved that it feels unfair. And I think rightly so, sort of criticized from afar. But the thing I always say is, you know, you want to get the story right because you want them to win, right? And this is what I say a lot is like, this is for the movement. That's why it's important to kind of raise up a mirror, as you've said before, Luis, to what's going on here. Which, you know, I think that is, of course, it's a fine line to walk. And I certainly can say that it's very unusual still, even with more labor reporters existing now in the United States. Still is often a foreign concept to the workers I'm meeting on a picket line. The idea that, you know, they meet a lot of journalists with distrust that is very well earned. And the idea of a partisan kind of the working class who's also a journalist is very, you know, unusual still. And I think all of us on this panel would kind of fit that mold. And so that trust does have to be earned over time. But I think it's not impossible to do. And actually, it's an important thing to model for other people and for workers that, you know, there is a press that could exist that would be kind of taking the side of the workers, but also trying to strengthen the campaigns rather than sell them out or, you know, make them look bad for the capitalist press. So I want to move into the Q&A here because I see that we have a bunch of questions already. And so I'm just going to read out some. I'll read out one at a time and kind of open it up for both Sarah and Luis first. And if I have any thoughts, I'll also jump in. So the first question here is from Rachel Seiwitz. I'm sorry if I get people's last names wrong. So Rachel would like to know how to integrate oneself into the labor communities you're interested in if you don't have actual experience or work history in the industry. How do you build up a community of trust in that, you know, community without having the work experience or kind of pre-existing tie? I think it's a good practical question. Thanks, Rachel.
I mean, so what I think you're asking is like, if you want to cover a specific industry that you've never worked in, how do you build trust in that? And like, I cover I've covered so many different types of work that I've never done, basically because the kinds of work that I've done are waiting tables, working in retail, and being a journalist. So that everything else is like, I've never done that. So one thing that works, frankly, is just like having work to show people. And that is to say that it gets easier as you've done more work. When you are just starting out, showing up. Sorry, there's a really annoying dog barking out here. Showing up, as Louise said, go to the picket lines, go to people's workplaces, and listen. You know, I was struck by what Alex was saying, that like there's a tension between what journalism demands of us and what organizing demands of us. But I actually think that that's like what good journalism demands of us is very similar to what good organizing demands of us. It's listening, it's being present, it's being accountable, it's being somebody that they can call the next day and not just disappearing. Whereas like the demands of sort of freelance reporting in the age of social media are build your brand, shank other people in the back, step on everyone, tweet out scoop when everybody else just got the same press release, that kind of crap. And so the stuff, again, that you need to do in order to build trust with the most important people, who are the workers, is in some ways the same kinds of things that you would do if you were trying to organize with them, which is just be present, pay attention, read widely about that field that you want to be writing about. But most importantly is still just listen to the workers. And I think that that's, you know, like nuts and bolts practicality. Sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's harder to get access to people, right? If you want to write about restaurant workers, you can go hang out in the restaurant. If you want to write about factory workers, you are not getting invited into that factory. So figuring out where the angles are, where the union is, if there is one, and how you get to know people. You know, when I was in Indiana for covering the Carrier plant story that was big, Trump's big deal in 2016, there was a dive bar across from the factory. That's where all the workers went afterwards. So, you know, go hang out at the dive bar across from the factory, make some friends. There are all sorts of sort of interesting ways to show up, but mostly the real big secret of journalism is people love to talk about themselves, and not that many people ask, like really interestedly, like, how was your day at work? What's your job like? What's the hard part about it? What would I need to know if I wanted to do your job tomorrow? Most people don't ask that. Most people are like, oh yeah, what do you do for a living? Cool. You're not useful to me. Move on. Particularly again in the media.
Luis, do you have any thoughts on this or no? Yeah, I think Sarah covered it well. And that is totally true, that people love talking about themselves. And you know, the sort of corny advice I could have given when I asked everyone about advice for young reporters is genuinely just be curious and interested in people. You cannot do this job, probably any type of reporting, but certainly not labor reporting, which is a real slog. You know, you have to want to do it unless you really care about what working class people's lives are like. You can't fake it. In fact, I was just watching Obama has a Netflix show called Working, taken from the sort of a king of labor journalism, Studs Terkel's title of his book. And really, not to go off on a tangent, but you get that Obama is just bored by the people he's talking to. And so he doesn't ask good questions. So it really does show, and you won't get good material if you're not really interested in a lengthy, you know, dive bar conversation with, say, a factory worker or something like that.
Thank you for teaching that so we don't have to, Alex.
Yeah. Well, I would say no problem, but actually it was painful. So another question here is, there are many questions. Thank you, everyone. So there was a question that has now been moved in the document. Let me see. I thought it was good. So yes, from Kathy who asked, can you talk more about how much reporting and sourcing you get or have before pitching, especially as a freelancer? How do you maintain relationships with new or recurring sources when there's no guarantee of the story's publication? I think that's a great question. So either of you, but I'm sure Sarah especially has a lot of thoughts about this from freelancing, but both of you.
But I just talked so much, somebody else should talk.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'll take it on. Yeah, I mean, It's happened to me where I have pitched a story and then I talk to folks and I think like, okay, maybe this is not like what I had initially thought, and then I don't report it or hold off on it. So that has happened. I mean, I think one editor that I've had a good relationship on this has been David Dayan over at the American Prospect. I just have liked working with him very closely, and I think so. I guess the way to address the question is that it depends on the editor. I think having like a good relationship with an editor, and I'm part of the Freelance Solidarity Union, and we've negotiated like kill fees, for instance. Like if you get a pitch accepted, and for whatever reason, the story is killed, like those are all improvements to our contract labor that we have won as freelancers that I think help. But I do try to do some pre-reporting though, for the most part, before I pitch. I have like an idea of where I want the story to go, so that I can make a case for it. And I think over time, it's gotten easier to send out like a pitch. Like I can say, like for the Amazon Labor Union, there was a lot of pressure to write like a profile of like Chris, for instance. And I always countered like, I'm going to write a collective profile of the organizers. And I always try to do that. So I think even as you're starting as a freelancer, I think it's helpful to push back and to also give a sense of like, hey, what do you have and what you may need? So some editors are more flexible than others. So there have been times where an editor has shared some sources, for instance, with me that when I was starting out, it said like, I have this, and it was like, okay, how about you talk to this other person too? So I think those are the best relationships.
Yeah. And so two related questions here from folks in the audience. Emma Dinsmore asks, what publications do you think do a good job on reporting about labor? And then relatedly, Lynn Jans has asked, on the note of being transparent about labor, can you speak to which publications you've enjoyed working with and writing for that you felt respected as a writer? So I want everybody to chime in with these answers. So by all means, go ahead, whoever has first thoughts.
Well, Luis just gave a big shout out to Dave Dayan at the Prospect, but I will second that. I love Dave. I also still write for The Nation, still enjoy writing for The Nation, and several editors there that I've worked with, everything from the book section to Don Gutenplan directly. Like, it's been great. In These Times has a long record of covering labor. But mostly, honestly, I don't go to publications. I follow people. So like if I'm wondering if something good has happened, I go look at like Alex. What is Alex writing about it? What is Luis writing about it? What is somebody else? There's a list of people whose work also may show up in different places, but I want to know what they're doing rather than necessarily that publication. Because I write for a lot of places that I am maybe one of a very occasional group of people. Like, I think all of us have written things for like the Times and the Washington Post, but I would not say that those publications have good labor coverage. Sometimes they will commission somebody like us to do something. Tammy Kim has a semi-regular beat at the Times, but like there aren't too many places that I'm like are doing a really great job that are currently like focused on it, I think I spend a lot of time looking at the reporters that I trust, because a lot of us are freelance, or even if like Alex, they have a day job, they're still also freelancing, or both of you actually have like one job and then also write other places. So just because Alex hasn't written about it at Jacobin doesn't mean she won't have written about it somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also about the relationships that you have with the editors, right? Like, I think for labor stories, like I sometimes want to write like narrative stories, or I want to go on like a trip and like, and sometimes like the pressures for the labor beat is that you get like scoops and you're the first, you write like 800 words and like there isn't as much excitement, because even even still, like labor stories don't go as viral as like some of the other political commentary out there. So even with the resurgence of like labor journalism, like it's still tough out there for the work, for us as reporters and for the workers too, that we're covering. But I really have liked working with the Real News Network, Max Alvarez. I have a good relationship with folks over at Indies Times as well. The American Prospect, which I already mentioned. The Nation, I've written for The Nation, but not as much. Partly because I sometimes want, like, one of the slogs that I hate about reporting as a freelancer is waiting for your pitch to be accepted. So there are some places where I have an easier relationship and I just say like, hey, would you be interested in this? And it's like, yes, all right. So I want to invest most of my time in talking to workers, not like sending out like pitches. So I think because of that reason, there's some places where I automatically go to. I've also liked working with the Baffler as well for longer pieces. So yeah, I loved working with Katie at the New Republic. She was so great. But now she's at Curb for New York Magazine. So those are some places. So if you have a housing story, pitch Katie at Curb.
Right. Yeah. Oh.
Can I just wanted to say there's also a couple of funds that are supporting labor journalism. So the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, which Barbara Ehrenreich founded, the Investigative Fund at the Nation or the Type Media Center, and now the Amidyar Network is like funding short-term fellowships for labor reporting. So there is sort of money out there that will do things like pay for the kind of narrative reporting Luis was saying that a lot of publications just straight up don't have $5,000 to give you to go cover something, but you can get extra money and then be able to do it.
Yeah. So I won't kind of repeat the various people and publications that Sarah and Luis mentioned, though I'll say one funny thing. A person who's come up is Josh Edelson at Bloomberg. So I think none of us on this call would say Bloomberg is a friendly publication to the working class. And yet, I've spoken to Josh about this personally. The irony here is Josh is sort of probably one of the best resourced labor reporters. And, he's a very accurate reporter. He is someone that I've never seen get things wrong, especially with scoops and early stories. And so, as paradoxical as it is to say that, Labor Notes and Josh at Bloomberg would be two places I actually look, because that seems absurd. It actually is true that, I think Josh recognizes the strangeness of his position, that, having those kind of resources really is something that the three of us don't always have. To be able to kind of constantly be up on everything that's happening. But I would just underline that Labor Notes really, I find, is an incredible resource as far as like the extent of the institutional knowledge there, because it is also a political organizing project, is just, talking about knowing who to call, who does know stuff. Often it's someone who has written something for Labor Notes before about their industry. And, I'm currently probably about to go to Erie, Pennsylvania to cover a likely strike. And I mean, Labor Notes is helping with that. We're going to co-publish with Jacobin. And it was incredible, the Labor Notes staffer, Dan DiMaggio, just the amount of information he knew about this particular shop. That was invaluable. I could not have, it would have taken me weeks of being in Erie to figure out everything that some of these people at these institutions already know. So I want to ask another question. We have about 10 minutes left here. So Aaron Grun asks, how do you convince important sources who are reluctant to speak with you to go on the record? And certainly that is not only important sources, but, people I know in the labor movement on the labor beat, often these are people who are risking a lot to go on the record. So I think this is a great question. Sarah,
I think, one of the most important things in this work is that, and this is something that my journalism school actually, I think, did a fairly decent job of talking about, is that we're dealing with two kinds of people when you're on the labor beat. You're dealing with three kinds of people. You're dealing with bosses who they can, whatever. I love nothing more than writing a really grumpy email to a boss who's been really crappy to their workers and asking them for comment. That's fun. I don't have to be nice to them. The real difference is between workers who absolutely have no obligation to tell me anything. They are private people. They are allowed to be private. And they are often, as you said, Alex, risking a lot. And so if they don't want to use their name, that's fine. That's cool. My different publications have different rules around what kind of anonymity you can give people. But your obligation in those situations, I feel very strongly about this, is to take care of your sources because they are probably not nearly as media savvy as you are. And then there's, say, union leadership, who are resourced, supported, probably have a comms department. Whether or not it's a good comms department is another story. And they do have more of an obligation to speak to you. And they are responsible for things in a different way. And they probably are also quite good in many cases at dealing with the press. And so you are dealing with somebody in that case, and if they don't want to talk to you, you have a little bit more charitably, I would say, leeway, maybe also responsibility to press a little bit harder and say like, hey, I need some answers here. But when it comes to the workers, the willingness that they have to talk to you is a gift that they are giving, that you are earning. And if you screw it up and blow those sources, that's something that is not easy to repair. So the most important responsibility, I think, in those cases is to make people comfortable rather than press them. I have not had a lot of problems getting stories from people that I've had time to sit down with and just be like, tell me about yourself. And in some of those cases, I'm also going back through what they said and going, I don't think I'm going to publish that, because they might not have realized that could get them in trouble. That's a responsibility that I think is really different than trying to, get questions answered from the comms department at the local union, who's going to give you a statement that they've pre-written for their boss. If that answers that question at all.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I do sometimes, because it's about ultimately building relationships with workers, is we'll have a conversation off the record, we'll move to on background, and then eventually folks will open up, So I think it's about investing the time and effort into getting to know people, and knowing what's happening. So, and sometimes I might know about something, and let's say the New York Times publishes it because ultimately I'm thinking about what is the organizing story. I'm not thinking about like, what is the most sensational thing that I could publish right now? Like the calculation is different. So sometimes I know more than what I may include in a story at the time. So I think the best way to think about it is, if your beat, let's say, is logistics workers, you may know about a plan about some coordinated strikes months in advance, and you're not going to, share that until the time is right. Or you may not even be the one that breaks the story, because ultimately it's more important that you're supporting the organizing so that those coordinated strikes are successful. Yeah.
I think those both answer the question more. I don't need to go into it. I want to combine a couple of people asked sort of similar questions here. Maybe this will be the last one we have time for, which is a really practical question, right? So we've talked about how important it is to kind of like find the workers on, whether it's the picket line or otherwise, kind of finding the people involved in the story. And that sometimes a union's comms department isn't the most helpful, or they'll just sort of direct you to one or two people at a company or a shop. And that's not exactly what you want. So practically, how do you, I won't read who asked this because I'm combining a couple here, but what are strategies for getting in touch with individuals, beyond showing up at a picket line? Say, I mean, often it's not an active strike. That's sort of an easy question if there is. How do you find the workers at this company, in a particular industry, and including when they don't have a union, right? So non-union workers, practically, how do you get sources?
I think that's the first question is like, why are you trying to find them? Is it because you walk by this big store every day on your way to work or whatever, and you think like, wow, that place, I wonder what the working conditions are like in there? Or is it because you've heard a rumor or you read somebody else's story and you want to follow up on it? Or is it because somebody reached out to you and said like, hey, I hear there's, something happening at this place? The first question of sort of where do you get sources is like, it's also where do you get stories? And that is going to sort of shape how you get the sources, right? Like the big story in the New York Times a few years ago about nail salon workers. As far as I know, it was basically started by the reporter being like, I go to nail salons a lot. I wonder what these people's working conditions are like. And what she didn't do, notably, is reach out to find out if anybody had been organizing nail salon workers, because they had been, in fact. But that was somebody who just sort of got the idea that like, this is interesting work. My first question would be like, if you are interested in the kind of work because the place or the industry or the whatever interests you, who are the unions? Who are the people who might be organizing those workers? Work through those kinds of networks, which are things that, again, you sort of, in a city like New York, which is where I'm sitting right now, even though I don't live here anymore, it can take a while to learn those networks and who the people are, but that's usually a good place to start. Otherwise, like, you know, if you found out about a story because you heard that there was a union drive there, who'd you hear it from? How'd you find out about it? Who do they know? Who can they introduce you to? At this point, you know, I get a lot of stories because people reach out to me, either comms people reach out to me or individual people reach out to me. And that is sometimes relationships that I've built for a long time, and other times it's relationships that I've built because people have read my work and they're like, hey, she seems like she would cover this well. But when that's not available to you, a lot of it is like, yeah, it's sort of a slow moving process of embedding yourself in the place that you live and the place that you want to be working. And that, like, not to be all Jane McAlevey, but I'm always all Jane McAlevey. There kind of are no shortcuts to finding good stories any more than there are to good organizing.
I mean, go to the Labor Notes Conference, April 2024. You'll find a lot of workers there, and you can strike up some conversations. That's a good place for sourcing. I mean, I'm part of, like Sarah mentioned, some of it is already doing the work. People know you, they invite you into networks. So I'm part of like WhatsApp groups where workers are talking among each other about strategy, Facebook groups. So sometimes I hit people up on Facebook, people on Twitter as well. So those are like some of the practical ways beyond like physically going to a picket line.
Yeah, I especially asked that one to have an excuse to say that Facebook groups are, in fact, extremely great sources for finding people, as well as any other kind of social media. You'd be shocked by how active, people are. And Reddit, I mean, I've written a lot about Chipotle. The Chipotle's workers have like a subreddit where they're constantly posting things. I mean, it's shocking what you can kind of get from there and people you can kind of get in touch with that you wouldn't otherwise have. This has been fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for in the audience, as well as Sarah and Luis. I just want to close on one last short one, if either of you have thoughts on this, which was from Zuri Pope, who asked, what labor reporters from the past inspired you to cover this topic? And if you have any other closing thoughts along the line of this type of work, by all means.
I already mentioned Liza Featherstone and Barbara Ehrenreich. I got to say Barbara Ehrenreich again, and also Mike Davis, because we lost them within a couple months of each other recently, and I'm still not over it. There are just a lot of incredible people who were doing this really thankless work in a really thankless time for caring about workers, which is to say the 1990s and the 80s, that I'm still sort of picking up their books. I finally just read Prisoners of the American Dream. Don't you two yell at me. And I was just blown away by how much like Mike Davis predicted about the next 20 years.
I would say back issues of Labor Notes, things like Mike Parker, Jane Slaughter. Also the proletarian literature from the 30s. Go to the Tamerman Library if you're in New York, read the Daily Worker.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I would just echo, like, there's incredible literature from, the earlier 20th century that are like books by workers who are organizing or kind of radicals who were unionizing, whether Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's autobiography, there's just all these incredible kind of people from the past that I think, and then more recent, I also feel the need to invoke Barbara Ehrenreich and Mike Davis. I mean, both of whom I think model like a politically committed writer who also takes writing very seriously, like stylistically, material wise, while also being accountable to the people and movements that they're writing about. In closing, thank you, everyone. This has been fantastic, and I'm so glad we had an excuse for the three of us to catch up on the state of the labor beat. Thanks all.